I'm going to introduce our third speaker from Ateneo de Davao to present his paper titled Sanctifica in Veritate, The Truth as the Limit to Academic Freedom in Catholic Universities. Ladies and gentlemen, please let's give our warm welcome to Mr. Raven Castañeda.
Hello, good afternoon. My name is Raven. I'm just a caveat. I'm not really a philosophy major. I'm a medical biology major from Ateneo de Davao University. So if there might be some inaccuracies in my paper, it's because I'm not a philo major. So my paper is entitled Sanctifica in Veritate, The Truth as the Limit to Academic Freedom in Catholic Education. So I'm just going to read parts of the paper because time would not permit me to read the whole paper. So the modern conception of academic freedom is an expedient solution invented as an attempt to solve the crisis of misology that has diffused through virtually every university today. But this expedient solution is as intellectually lazy as it is practically ineffective. While we continue to brag about this great invention and to fight tooth and nail to protect it, the universities continue to rot at its core, fragmenting at each and every unsolved conflict, while we brag about the beauty of this endless, disjointed diversity that the academic freedom has created in the universities. In the Philippines, academic freedom is the primary right guaranteed to the universities by the Republic Act 7722, also known as the Higher Education Act of 1994. In Philippine jurisprudence, the definition of academic freedom is adopted from the landmark case Sweezy versus New Hampshire, where U.S. Supreme Court Justice J. Frankfurter enumerates the following capacities under the right to academic freedom: the right to determine who may teach, what may be taught, how it shall be taught, and who may be admitted to study. The reason behind the definition is to prevent universities from becoming an instrument of propaganda. It is true that universities and educators should be protected from those who wish to use them for purposes of propaganda. But while it is true that educators must not in any way be coerced to be propagandists of the state or any interested, ideologically motivated bodies, this freedom should not be made absolute. It should not be unbounded. Yet, this absolute freedom seems to be the assumption of many people in the universities, especially in the university where I come from. In fact, the definition offered by the proponents of this new understanding is what the American Association of University Professors, or AAUP, gave in their 1915 Declaration of Principles on Academic Freedom and Academic Tenure. They say that academic freedom is the right of the scholar to be, quote, absolutely free, not only to pursue his investigations, but to declare the results of his researches, no matter where they may lead him or to what extent they may come into conflict with accepted opinion, end quote. The problem is that this definition is ambiguous in principle and incoherent in practice. What does absolutely free mean? What about accepted opinion? What is the relation of this freedom to truth, not only to mere individual facts of history or scientific data, but also to logically demonstrable truths? Does this definition mean that a professor can teach that this definition is wrong? And does allowing such a rejection by a professor not undermine the whole project of the modern university to absolutely free the educators? But does not the converse do the same? Lastly, if the purpose of academic freedom is to prevent professors from being used to push the ideologies of some interested groups, what happens when it is the professors themselves who wish to push their own ideologies? Does anybody have the right to police them? But even with such ambiguity and incoherence, this new understanding of academic freedom has been so ingrained in the university's self-conception that it now claims the academic freedom to be the, quote, constituent element of the very foundation upon which the modern university rests, end quote. That is to say that if an educational institution is to be considered a university, or at least a modern university, it must accept this definition or this understanding of academic freedom. In his Apostolic Constitution on Catholic Universities Ex Corde Ecclesia, Pope John Paul II has called for a continuous renewal, both as universities and as in Catholic universities. However, such a renewal would be difficult to usher because of the contemporary demands on what a university is, or what a university ought to be. Worse, not only did the contemporary demands make it difficult to usher such a renewal, it has also made it difficult to preserve the Catholicity of a certain university. This paper will not argue that academic freedom should be altogether abrogated. Rather, it will argue that the right to academic freedom is not absolute and thus has a limit. So the main thesis of this paper is this: the truth is the limit to academic freedom, and the truth is the limit to academic freedom, and it is so inasmuch as 1, the university has a mandate to truth. 2nd, man who occupies the university is a rational being. And 3rd, the truth is what renders freedom possible, even academic freedom, thus allowing man to pursue the common good. Every university recognizes that it has a mandate to truth, and it has a mandate to defend the truth from those who wish to hide it or to twist it to suit their agenda, to transmit the truth to the next generation, and lastly, to further our knowledge of it through research. So for now, I'm going to focus on the second part of the argument, which is the fact that man is a rational animal, and therefore the truth must be the limit. The truth that man is called to search, to look for, should be the limit to such a freedom. It is the case that the absolutizing of academic freedom created a culture of undifferentiated pluralism and relativism. This culture formed men with a skeptical attitude towards their own rational capacity for truth. And this attitude has created an opinion-centered world. As the Jesuit philosopher, Reverend Father Michael Moga, observes that, quote, one basic mindset found in the modern life is a tendency to consider all human affirmations as mere personal opinions. And we see it systematized in the modern technique of polling, end quote. Well, maybe with the presentation of Father Nicanor Austriaco earlier, we can also say that it is also systematized with the data gathering of AI, deep learning. Well, aside from politicians and businessmen, educators similarly set up courses of study on this very basis. Kung anong sikat, then yun ang ituturo. Moga finds strange the phenomenon that while almost everyone affirmed the value of truth, there is a strong tendency to ignore it or to question its possibility. It is as if the modern man both affirms and denies truth at the same time. Perhaps the reason for this is that while most people think that truth exists, they find it difficult to believe that it is within our capacity, that it is within the capacity of man to know it and to access it. Because of this, there is no substrate by which people can really agree or disagree. That is, except from the similarity of their personal opinions and polling behavior, they cannot say that there is a justified and reasonable ground beneath their similarity of their opinions. Rather, they are just simply the same. When you put this in the perspective of the state, and much more in the perspective of the whole of humanity, there is a phenomenon where often opinion has come to take on the aura of truth, as our sense of what is true seems to be determined by such opinion polls. That last part came from Father Moga. Worse is that even moral and religious truths are not now being judged based on opinion polls. Any answer to every moral and religious question now has the same value, the same validity. But such a value and validity is merely private. As Moga notes, quote, when personal opinions are in conflict with one another, it is impossible to settle the conflict by invoking some objective criterion which is normative for everyone, a universal criterion. We can only count the number of opinions on each side of the question and possibly draw some conclusion from that numbering, end quote. And in such an approach, there is no room for a truth which possesses objectivity and generality. In an opinion-centered world, there is no truth, only a mere opinion enshrined by a mere consensus, and oftentimes at the expense of truth, especially when the truth is held only by a minority population. On this point, Moga is echoing what Pope John Paul II said in Fides et Ratio, quote, denying truth its elusive character and assuming that truth reveals itself equally in different doctrines, even if they contradict one another, everything is now reduced to opinion, and there is a sense of being adrift, end quote. This opinion-centered world comes from an overemphasis of man's own ignorance. It comes from the fact that modern man knows so much facts, so much data, and continues to discover a lot. And this gave an impression that while man acquires more knowledge by the day, there's an even greater body of knowledge unbeknownst to man. That is, there are more facts than man can ever demonstrate. Moreover, man has been so preoccupied with the demonstration of individual facts that he barely has time to bring these individual data into the unity of truth. What John Paul said about the human reason is thus attributable to man himself. Quote, man has wilted under the weight of so much knowledge and little by little has lost the capacity to lift its gaze to the heights, not daring to rise to the truth of being, end quote. Note that John Paul II here is not saying that man is unable to rise to the truth of being. Rather, he says that he is unwilling, not daring to attempt to rise from lower forms of knowledge to the higher forms of knowledge. The reason is that the weight of so much knowledge is oftentimes accompanied by the force of apparent contradictions. It is not only the case that there is so much that he knows, but also that there is so much that does not make sense. And in every contradiction that does not make sense, there is not much that we can do about, or so they say. But man's solution to this problem of apparent contradictions and accumulated disagreements is to say that man simply does not know, and perhaps he can never really know, what is true. And from this, he claims that it is absurd to attempt to grasp a truth that evades all grasping. So practically, the modern man's solution to the loss of confidence in reason would be to perpetuate dialogue in hope that someone else would be convinced of his half-hearted conviction. This perpetuated dialogue is punctuated with voting sessions where people temporarily elect an opinion as their guiding truth. But when they vote on an opinion as guiding truth, it is not because they are convinced of its truth value. Rather, it is because it is the most convenient given the signs of the times. And when the signs of the times changes, they depose one opinion and elect another, again as a guiding truth. This is evident again in the fixation of the opinion-centered world on polling. When truth is determined by consensus, truth will inevitably change along with a change in the composition of the population. In this world, when consensus changes, the truth changes as well. Hence, modern man finds solace in the framework of thinking that was already condemned by Pope Pius X in 1907, namely, truth is no more immutable than man himself, since it evolved with him, through him, and in him. End quote. But the condemned framework of thinking is exactly the framework adopted by the proponents of modern understanding of academic freedom. For instance, Father Joel Tabora says that his definition of academic freedom is that freedom from coercions of ideologies, dogmas, and fixed doctrines. So this is his definition in a speech in front of the Congress with regards to academic freedom. Note that there was not even a distinction between the coercion of false beliefs and the coercive power, coercive weight of truth itself, as defined in dogmas and fixed doctrines, as in the church, for instance. And how will there be a distinction if both arbitrary opinions of false beliefs, on one hand, and truth itself, on the other, are lumped into the same category and awarded the same value? In any case, this lumping together of false beliefs and truth in one category of ideologies, dogmas, and fixed doctrines is the reason why even a discussion on truth that trumps all false doctrines is discouraged in a modern university. The contradictory claims that something remaining as such is and is not are at least possibly both true at the same time in the eyes of these modern universities. But man knows by common sense that a belief remaining as such cannot be both false and true at the same time. And because of that, nor can they be awarded the same value. So this rejection of the principle of contradiction, also called the principle of non-contradiction, is what underlies the pluralism and relativism of the modern conception of academic freedom. But it does not stand alone. This rejection actually stands on the rejection of Thomistic realism, as encapsulated in the principle of idealism of Edward Leroy, Henri Bergson, and Leon Brunswick, that Reverend Father Reginald Garrigou-Lagrange of the Order of Preachers disputed in an article for the Angelicum magazine in 1933. Garrigou-Lagrange writes that the principle of idealism is formulated in this way. Whatever is outside of the mind is unknowable. What the idealists mean by such a principle is that the mind is only capable of knowing mental likenesses that are outside of the mind, not the things themselves. Moreover, the mind is unable to compare these mental likenesses with the things themselves. Hence, there is no way to confirm the conformity of the mental likeness to the real being that exists outside the mind. This principle of idealism is at the root of the modern conception of academic freedom. The only reason that justifies the idea that one is free to question anything and everything, as Father Joel Tabor writes, is if Leroy is right in saying that an exterior, something beyond thought, is by definition something absolutely inconceivable. After all, as Brunswick wrote, how will it be possible for realism to assert the resemblance of the original in the knowing subject when by the very act of knowing, he is detached from the original? End quote. It is upon this principle that the idealists and the proponents of modern conception of academic freedom ground the rejection of the principle of contradiction altogether. They just reject the extra mental force or ontological or at least they don't totally abandon it. They just reject the extra mental force or ontological value of such a principle. They say that it is merely a law of discourse and thought. What is the consequence of saying that the principle of contradiction is merely a law of discourse and thought? This means that contradictions, while it may be inconceivable, can actually be realizable in things outside the mind. As Descartes says, while a square circle is something inconceivable to us, it could be that it is not something really impossible outside the mind. So to say that whatever is outside the mind is unknowable ultimately leads to the idea that contradictories can simultaneously be true, and then leads to perpetuated dialogue that does not lead to anything because of two reasons. One, the real strength of whatever truth claims they seek or they talk about will always remain in doubt. Hence, it is impossible to ascertain whether their conversation is leading somewhere. That is conformity with reality. But two, even when they disagree, the disagreement is not of any value since contradictions are realizable outside the mind. Their disagreement is thus merely a disagreement in the way they formulate a description of reality, not a disagreement in reality itself. One could refute the rejection to the principle of contradiction only by an argumentum ad absurdum because it is a principle that is self-evident and not really demonstrable. Following the rejection of the principle of contradiction, however, there seems to be a vacuum in words and discourse, as there will be no meaning to anything said. Any discussion about truth or even a discussion about opinion would not be possible, since an opinion always leans to one side and against the other. But without the principle, the opposition between two sides does not exist, since contradictories may be realizable outside the mind. From this, there would be no diversity of things, and the merely probable opinion would disappear. But with regard to the rejection of principle of contradiction, Garrigou-Lagrange writes, quote, to deny the necessity and real value of the principle of contradiction, or even to doubt it, condemns one to the most absolute form of nihilism. One could no longer say anything, think anything, desire anything, will anything, or do anything, end quote. But is this not exactly what is happening in the perpetuated dialogues in modern universities, where every professor say virtually everything that does not mean anything, and where all students are encouraged to think anything for as long as they hold fast to nothing? Garrigou-Lagrange is right when he argued that, quote, without the ontological first principle, every judgment of the existential order becomes impossible, as does every judgment concerning the mind itself, end quote. The rejection of the principle of contradiction renders thinking not only without value, but also impossible. After all, if one claims to be thinking, it would not be impossible, according to idealists, that whatever thought one has in mind can both be thought and non-thought at the same time. One can even hold that those who subscribe to an absolute academic freedom is so liberated enough that they are free not only from all reality, but also from all thought. They are not so free to think, they are not only so free to think, but also they are so free that they require no thinking. After all, after the discovery of the liberty or autonomy of his own spirit, the idealist cannot affirm that anything else is coherent with himself. That last part came from Garrigou. Hence, Etienne Gilson writes that the principle of idealism, that which is outside of thought is not thinkable, is not only the perfect formulation of idealism, it is also its own condemnation. Modern universities are modern because they follow and seem to dogmatize the modern philosophies. And these modern philosophies claim to thrive in contradictions. They claim to find truth between what is and what is not, a place that even Aristotle does not exist. And as much as it is nowhere and nothing, it is also not fruitful. After all, what sane farmer would expect a fruit from a tree that he waters as he cuts it down, in a plant he both cultivates and destroys? Inasmuch as it is no thing, it is also nothing. This is why I believe modern students of modern universities, while they claim to be so critical in their thinking, are unable to decide nothing about everything. Hence, if academic freedom is to be fruitful, if it is to find the truth that it claims to seek, it also must have truth as its limit. Truth cannot and will not come from a synthesis of truth and falsehood. No one comes to the truth except through an already known truth. This is the age-old conviction of the Catholic faith, and the same must hold true for a Catholic university. Do I have time for just a conclusion? Or 1 minute. So this is just the conclusion. Why should a Catholic university care so much about the truth? Well, aside from the fact that it is a university that has a mandate to truth, it is also Catholic. And the Gospels have provided two descriptions of what truth does. The first is Veritas liberavit vos, the truth shall set you free. And it is indeed the whole principle around which Pope Leo XIII based his understanding of freedom, and following him, John Paul II required truth to be the limit to academic freedom in Excordia Ecclesiae. The second is Sanctifica eos in Veritate, which is the title of this paper. Sanctify them in truth. This is basically the logical conclusion of the first description. Nevertheless, it is not only the absolute firmness that is important, it is also the radiation of charity. For Garrigou-Lagrange, firmness of faith and radiation of charity must be united very intimately in us, so that the firmness of faith never degenerates into sectarian rigidity, and so that charity towards our neighbor never degenerates into a form of culpable weakness and opportunism. Without a profound respect for truth, a university will cease to exist as it ought to be, much less a Catholic university. It has to hold on to the truth no matter what the cost. As the exhortation of John Paul II in Excordia Ecclesiae reminds us, quote, if need be, a Catholic university must have the courage to speak uncomfortable truths which do not please public opinion, end quote. After all, the university is not there to please the people. Rather, it is its mandate, its calling, and its greatest honor to sanctify them in truth. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mr. Castañeda. I think a beautiful talk, especially when you talk about the problem of truth in a post-truth world, diba? We always end up seeing the problem of relativism.
In terms of individualism, actually the third part of my paper would talk about freedom and the idea that this academic freedom absolutists, I call them absolutists, kasi nga they want absolute academic freedom. They have a different understanding of freedom and common good compared to those that subscribe to Thomasian, or to those who subscribe to the Catholic intellectual tradition. They have a different understanding of freedom, and one of the main points is that for them, the freedom of the individual. So the freedom of the individual must take precedence, such that what happens, so to speak, when we talk about the universities is the idea of common good, diba? The university must work towards a common good. Father Nicanor Austriaco mentioned that earlier in his plenary. So, but with the absolutist, common good becomes equated with individual freedoms. Whatever one person wants, yun yung so kung anong gusto niya maging totoo. If whatever he believes is true for himself, meron pa kasi lang sinasabi na maybe that's your truth, but my truth is different. So each of us therefore would have different truths. So ito na yung nangyayari, nagiging undifferentiated pluralism, to use the term of John Paul II. And what this individualism does is to equate common good with freedom, such that the university therefore would only be interested in protecting the individual freedom, which they call as common good, at the expense of truth, at the expense of what is true. What happens is, yung teachers, ang nangyayari inside the classrooms is, he would just talk about facts, and then let the students decide for themselves what is the theory, or what is the truth that comes out of those individual facts, or even following the advice of Doc Montagna, if the teacher teaches about theory, ang nangyayari is that he just talks about different theories and then let you pick whatever you want without trying to compare those theories and see which is closer to the truth. Or the last thing I would say is that in terms of classroom and Sir Reyes and I were talking about this earlier, is that even when we say that teachers would introduce many different theories and then try to compare them, the probability that that teacher is equipped to talk about Thomasian, Castañeda, or Cartesian philosophy equally in an equally competent way, is low. So meaning, we have students therefore, for instance, in Ateneo de Davao, where most of them, even though we're introduced to the idea of Thomism in ethics, or yung deontology in ethics, mas marami pa rin yung, or in philosophy, for example, mas marami pa rin who would subscribe to critical theory, because the teachers there are more equipped to talk about critical theory than they are equipped to talk about Thomism or Kant or any other philosophers in that tradition. So, with that, tying back to the question, in terms of individualism, I think that we have to recover a reverence for truth, such that we don't allow our interest to protect freedom to take precedence over our interest for the truth. So